Well, good afternoon. My name is Mitch Meyers. I'm with the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. Today is August 29th, 2022. It's my honor and privilege to introduce my good friend, Billy Jacobs. How you doing?
I'm good, Mitch.
I'm glad you're here. Thanks for coming.
Being with you, I'm going to be good no matter where we are.
That's fabulous. So tell us your full name.
Born William Robert Jacobs.
And when were you born?
I was born on February 13th, 1948, in the middle of a big snowstorm in Manhattan, New York City.
There you go. That was my next question. You answered it. I love it. So why did your parents select your name?
Robert, I have no idea. William is from a great-grandparent, so I'm told. But beyond that, I really don't know.
Okay, and tell us where your family's from, parents, grandparents.
Yeah, Mitch. My dad was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1924. My mom was born in New York City in 1927. My father's parents came to the United States from Russia and parts of what is now Romania and eastern Poland at the turn of the century, so the late 1800s. I've seen a manifest from the boat that came over that left out of Hanover, Germany. Both his parents were born in the United States. Those were his grandparents. My mother, both her parents were also born in the U.S., both from New York. And her great-grandparents came from Alsace-Lorraine region of France and from extreme western Germany near the French border in the region of Alsace-Lorraine. And they actually came to the United States in the late 1800s, lived here. I've seen pictures of my great-grandparents from my parents' wedding, and they were still alive then. And that was in 1946. I never met them.
But you had met your grandparents and they lived in New York?
Yes.
Growing up?
Yeah. When I was born, we lived in Washington Heights, and the apartment we lived in was one flight above my grandparents on my mother's side. So up until the age of 4, I hung out around Washington Heights. We went to Fort Tryon Park, which is still there. And my memories are all from home motion pictures. I don't recall any of it, to be honest. But at the age of 4, we moved out to Long Island, a town called Valley Stream, because my brother was being born, and my parents wanted to have a bigger place and more of a community to live in beyond an apartment building. So my brother was born in 1952. His name is Gary Jacobs. My mom's name is Gloria Feldman Jacobs. My father is Sanford Sandy Jacobs.
Okay.
And I lived in Valley Stream from age 4 up until age 11. I went to Forest Road Elementary School. The neighborhood I lived in was about 80% Jewish. I had no idea at that time what beyond that neighborhood the world was like. I thought everybody was Jewish then. Never occurred to me, really. When they had Jewish holidays at school, the only kids who went were the kids who weren't Jewish. There were a couple of times I went to school on a Jewish holiday just to see who was there, and there was maybe 4 other kids out of a class of 25.
That weren't Jewish, that were in
weren't
school.
Jewish.
Interesting.
Now that neighborhood I loved. I had a lot of friends. Sports was real big. One of my earliest sports memories was in the Little League parade on July 4th in downtown Valley Stream, or Green Acres, which is the subdivision I lived in, Green Acres. We had a team, and I was on the team in 2nd grade. I was the youngest you could be on it. Some of my friends hadn't turned 8 yet, but I had. So I got to be on the team in March. I have home pictures of that. And that feeling of marching in the uniform and being part of the Green Acres Little League was as exciting a feeling as I ever had in my life at that time.
That's fantastic, yeah. That's great. So describe your family's personalities at that time, living with your mom and dad and your brother And this is in Long Island, I guess,
Yes.
more recollection than like team.
I would have to say that I wouldn't call my family aloof as much as I would say that my dad was busy working pretty much all the time. I didn't see much of him. My mom was a very young mother. She was only 18 when I was born. So my parents were younger than most of the other kids' parents. And I think my mom was probably in over her head. She didn't really know what life was like to be a parent of two kids. And I can't remember a whole lot of contact that went on family-wise or family dinners. Unfortunately, I spent almost all my time out of the house, hanging out in the neighborhood with friends. My brother, Gary, was born with what was then called a clubfoot. He required numerous operations before the age of 2, which required lengthy hospitalizations back then in 1953-54 time period. And those were all done at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York. So during those operations, my parents were basically gone from doing any caretaking with me, and I stayed with my grandparents in Washington Heights during those periods.
So they moved out to Washington Heights with you?
Just for short periods during the surgeries and the recovery period. It didn't interfere with school or upbringing, but I think what it did do is made my mother especially nervous about our safety and the permanency of people. She was scared, I think, of losing loved ones. Never really knew why until later on. But at that point in time, I always thought there was kind of a distance, unlike a lot of other families. It wasn't a lack of love or caring. We were always taken care of. But I think there was an emotional disconnect that my mom was probably never capable of. And I think it was also true of my dad. He was the youngest of 5 kids, and his parents were not very close to him. My mother, there was only 2 children in my mom's family, but her older sister was 10 years older, and she was raised by her older sister, not her parents.
So you said your dad was busy working. What kind of profession did he have?
Then he worked for Downy Flake Donut Company, which was the sponsor of the Howdy Doody show.
Okay.
And that to me was really cool because he arranged for me to meet a couple of the characters from Howdy Doody, including Clarabelle the Clown, who actually came out to one of the Jewish rec spots on Atlantic Beach. And I can remember, I have a picture of a sign that said bar mitzvahs in the background, and then me and my cousin and my brother with Clarabelle the Clown in the foreground of that picture. The contrast was funny. But he worked for that company, and that kept him busy. But the childhood in Valley Stream was really nice. I was always out in the neighborhood, got in a fair amount of trouble climbing into construction that was done on what became the Green Acre Shopping Center, which was actually the first mall on Long Island.
Interesting.
At that time. But I got up on the roof and got tar all over me, and the cops came and picked me up and brought me home, and that's something my parents never failed to mention. Now, when it came to religious education and a Hebrew school, I went to the Reformed Hebrew school in Valley Stream. And I hate to admit it, but I hated it. To me, it was interfering with playing basketball or baseball. And my Hebrew school teacher felt I was a troublemaker. He called my parents in a couple of times and said I wasn't paying attention, and if I wasn't going to take it seriously, I shouldn't be in Hebrew school. So I was pulled out, and I didn't return while we lived in Long Island, and went right back to the playgrounds and just hung out and played sports. I was not a particularly good student. I did well, but I really had very little care about anything other than just enjoying sports and trying to catch all the Yankee games on TV.
Can you recall, or are you still friends with any of your friends back then?
I kept in touch with some of them. a couple of the guys I was closest friends with in Little League and through amateur basketball up to that time. They didn't play football then, not in New York. But basketball and baseball were big. One of them, Chuck Drimmel, went on to the University of Maryland, became the starting quarterback, and I saw him on TV against Oklahoma during my sophomore year of college. I realized that was the same guy. His wide receiver, a guy named Peter Blumenthal, went to Penn and set the all-time receiving record at the University of Pennsylvania at that time. Chuck Drimmel went on to be a very successful financier and lives in Connecticut. Peter Blumenthal lives in Florida, and he became a dentist and is retired as an oral pathologist. But I kept in touch with him.
That's fantastic. So 11 years old, second or third grade. And do you move somewhere? Did you?
Yes, my dad was transferred. And this was, if there was such a thing as a turning point in my life, this was it. Because we went from an idyllic neighborhood in Long Island, New York, to Dallas, Texas. And when we arrived, during the move, we stayed at a kind of a camp setting in upstate New York during the move. We had to be out of our house, but the home in Dallas wasn't ready yet. So we stayed there. And when we got to Dallas, after a month in upstate New York, my father had already bought the car there. And it was in mid-August, and we opened up the car door, and the needle on the speedometer had melted. I was in a 54 Ford, and it was the first thing I can remember was that it was so hot that it melted the needle in the dashboard. When I got to Dallas, it was culture shock. We were in a new neighborhood where tons of homes were going up, definitely the baby boom time. Had no friends, I had no sports contacts, and I basically hung out in my room for the next 5 years.
How old were you when you moved? I'm sorry.
I was going into 6th grade, so I was 11 and a half
11 and a half
when I moved.
Okay.
I went to 6th grade at a brand new school, the Goyer Elementary School. It's the first year. We were in barracks. They did not have a permanent building. In 7th grade, I went over to Cary Junior High School. Went there from 7th and 8th grade, and then they opened up a new junior high school called Marsh Junior High. So we were in the first class for Marsh Junior High. The next year in 10th grade, I went to Thomas Jefferson High School for 1 year, and then they opened up a new high school, W.T. White High School. When I went there in 11th grade, there was no senior class. There was only 10th and 11th grade there. So we were the first graduating class in 1966. But that meant 1, 2, 3, 6 different schools in the space of 5 years. And so there was no permanency to most of the things, from friends to schools to neighborhoods. I pretty much stayed to myself in my room, listening to music, watching TV, until my parents happened upon the Julius Shep's Community Center. In between 6th and 7th grade, they took me there. We were not members at the time, and we lived pretty far away. We weren't close. And they had a summer baseball league. And I played on a team in the summer baseball league, and all of a sudden the sun came out for a while. And my coach was Marty Goldman, who I still know and still love. He treated me fantastic. He's the first older guy I had ever been around who wasn't an authoritarian figure and didn't yell. He was just a nice guy and really encouraged me and the other kids on the team. And it was a blast. And I met a lot of guys who would become future close friends at that time. I just didn't know it when I first met them.
Right. So your first activities was going to the Julius Shep's Community Center.
Exactly.
Meeting Marty Goldman.
Met Alvin Miller at that time. I remember Alvin very well, and a guy named Alan Postel I met. A guy named Butch Ryder, some guys around the league. A humorous story, unfortunately, from that time, it wouldn't be humorous to him, was that anybody who showed up at the center and wanted to play baseball was on the team. And our right fielder, his He was pretty heavy set and wore glasses and was notorious for eating pickle slices during the game. And by this pool at the Sheps Community Center, you could always get little baskets of sliced pickles. And he brought it to the game, and he was eating them out in right field during the game, and a ball was hit to him, took one hop, hit him, and broke his glasses. He spilled the pickle juice into his eyes and had to be taken to the hospital for pickle burns. And I will never forget that story. Most people don't believe it happened, but it did. And so that's not an unusual story as I can recall some elements of my own life. But for some reason we got away from the community center. Maybe it was too far away. My mother didn't want to take me. My dad, with a new company, was a traveling salesman. He was gone for weeks at a time, and I hardly ever saw him. And my mom was left stuck in a new community with no friends at first. She felt isolated. Myself and my brother felt isolated. And being Jewish furthered that isolation, I think, at that time. I most definitely remember going out to the playground at Cary Junior High, and some of the kids throwing pennies out on the blacktop and saying, "Let's see what Jews will pick it up." That was a fairly common occurrence. I don't recall ever being included into any of the social scenes there. There was just some kind of ostracization that occurred that was below the surface that I wasn't aware of, but was most definitely there.
Did you get involved in AZA or BBYO, and how did you get involved if you did?
Yes, that was the second turning point, really, of my life. Was in 10th grade, we had moved into a new home in the W.T. White neighborhood, thus closer to the Jewish Community Center. And down the street, there was a family, and there was a kid named Freddie Shapiro, who was in Kaplan AZA. He's a year older than me. And when I was 15, I don't know if it was Freddie Dio or my mother spoke to his parents and said, "Hey, take Billy, get him into AZA, get him out of the house." And he did. And from that point on, that became the focal point of the rest of my time in Dallas till I went to college.
So were you bar mitzvah also here in Dallas?
Yes, I went to Temple Emmanuel. Rabbi Olin conducted the bar mitzvah, and I had to deal with my parents. I started going to Hebrew school as soon as we moved to Dallas, and the arrangement was, and I was at 11 and a half, so I wasn't that far from bar mitzvah time. The deal was I would not have to go to confirmation and get confirmed if I got bar mitzvah. So that's what I did, and I did get bar mitzvah when I was in 7th grade, and that was the end of my religious education at that point.
Okay, and then the next 3 years, you're still in that, staying in your room,
Yes.
listening to music?
Yeah, I played sports, with my school teams, but I was isolated from everything else.
Gotcha.
And was not part of the in-group.
Then Freddie introduces you to AZA and BBYO, and you
Yes.
thrive. That's another turning point for you. So tell us about that time, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade.
Yeah, I was in 10th grade. What I remember most clearly was that it was the week after the Kennedy assassination. So it was early December of 1963. I went to my first meeting, and it was at the Jewish Sheps Community Center. And it was an interesting group of people. And I was a pledge then, or whatever they were called. A guy named Arthur Eisenberg was the head of our pledge class. And I was in a group that included somebody who would become a lifelong friend, a guy named Mike Eisenberg, who we know as Izzy Eisenberg. And, immediately we started playing flag football, basketball, softball, and, that was my area of strength, so I fit in pretty well, and they were always looking for decent athletes to fill out their teams. So I kind of fell in with the older group of guys at that point that were playing on the mostly 12th graders team, but as a 10th grader, I played with those guys. One of the people I played with, a guy named Mark Benno, who later became a pretty well-known musician. Um, there was a lot of pretty good athletes a year older than I was, and we had some darn good teams. In softball, I was the starting shortstop in 10th grade, and we went to Fort Worth for the Fort Worth tournament, and we won it for the first time ever. So as a result of winning that, we all went over to Mark Benno's house, and he pulled out this album by a guy he called Bob Dylan, who I had never heard of. And he played the music, and that was my first introduction to folk rock music in my life. I never heard anything so neat. And that came from Mark Benno. And I eventually got in with a crowd of friends. I met a guy named Mark Shore between my 10th and 11th grade school year when I was transitioning from Thomas Jefferson to White. That summer, we were at a friend's house, and I met this guy who told me he was going to White. Told me he was going to go out for football. Turned out it was Mark. And we immediately shared a sense of humor. And that's kind of all it took for me. If we could laugh, that was enough. And Mark, as it turned out, had a group of friends who always got together, played football and hung out, and just enjoyed each other's company. And most of them were also in Kaplan AZA. Mark hadn't joined yet. I was in Kaplan before Mark. But he went to my school. Nobody else did. So it was just Mark and I who went to White High School. So we became pretty tight friends, and I'd carpool with him, and we'd go to places together. And we became best friends for the rest of our lives at that point. Of course, Mark told me he was going to be on the football team, and he made it through one practice and quit. So that didn't work out for Mark. But everything else did. And Mark's best friends included a group of guys who are still very close friends today. They played a Christmas game on Christmas. Jewish kids, of course, had nothing to do other than eat Chinese food. So he told me they played a football game. And at that time, it was not a ceremony or anything. They just happened to play on football. So that'd be a fun thing to do. So I joined that group. So the first time I played was 64, probably. And Christmas of 64. And I met during that time, or just before that, some really great guys that included Seth Meyers, who we called the Bear, his brother Ronnie, a year younger. They had a little brother who traipsed around following them all the time, called Mitchell, who I'm talking to right now. Steve Guto, who was kind of the de facto head of the group. A notorious prankster named Jumbo Kamen, Warren Kamen was his real name, but we called him Jumbo. A real little guy who was a cheerleader at Hillcrest High School called Chuck Lewis. Two younger guys who would come along, who were younger than us, named Mike Allen and Danny Lichtenstein. A friend of theirs named Albert Goodman. A friend of, and a buddy who lived at their house, Mike Grosfeld, who was close friends with both Seth and Ron, and whose parents were away, and so he stayed with them during his senior year. And all of us hung out together. And they kind of took me in as part of the group, and that's remained that way for almost 60 years.
Until today. So this Christmas Day Classic was football on Christmas Day. As I recall, sometimes you played during the day, sometimes you played at night, maybe on the weekends. I don't
yes,
know. Yes,
I mean, we played all the time. It wasn't just Christmas. It didn't become a classic right away. It probably took 5 or 6 years before somebody came up with the idea, let's call it the Christmas Day Classic. And we didn't celebrate it as a classic until year 10. And from that point on, it became a tradition, although we had started that tradition and never stopped it from 1964 on.
Wow.
But I didn't think we knew we were forming a tradition at the time that I can recall. Mostly it was a good, fun game, very competitive, relatively speaking. It was tackle football. It was rough. Some guys wound up in the emergency room. But when the game was over, then we all went and partied. And it was just something everybody started really looking forward to.
Yeah, that's great. That's great stories. So let's put in perspective what's going on in the world. And I know when you had just moved to Dallas, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Obviously, that's a big impact. What other world events were impacting or shaping your life or everybody's lives that you were around?
For me, I think the greatest shock I experienced was when I was in 6th grade. My parents took me down to the Majestic Theater, downtown Dallas. The bathrooms are in the basement. And I went down to the basement to use the bathroom, and I didn't understand it because one sign said white and one said colored. And I went back upstairs and asked my father, which one am I supposed to use? I didn't understand what it was all about. When he explained it to me, I just couldn't make sense of it. It's the first time I had really heard of such a thing. And that had a lasting impact to this day. I think from that moment on, one of the main themes that I focused on is inequality. And that's what I was focused on in high school, in college. I followed several friends like Steve Guto when we did certain events for registering voters in predominantly black neighborhoods in Austin when we were in college, marching for civil rights, joining civil rights organizations. I joined the NAACP, still have my card in my pocket. That was one influence that maybe superseded everything until Vietnam came along. And in 12th grade at White High School, I took a course called Problems of Democracy. And you were supposed to, for your semester project, research out what you consider to be a problem for democracy and present it to the class and teach it, and then give a test on it. And so I picked out the Vietnam War as my project. This was 66 school year. I researched it real heavily, presented all the information. And when I got a A on presentation and research and a B+ on topic because the teacher told me it wasn't a relevant topic at that time.
Yeah.
Somebody else did it, the Dallas Trinity River expansion project, and got an A, which never occurred, by the way. And I remember being incredibly deflated at that time. Several kids from our class went on to Vietnam. They were in ROTC and immediately went to Vietnam. And not all came back. But I remember just feeling really deflated, thinking that, how could I be so far off to think that was such a big deal, and I'm being told by the teacher it's not. My classmates, however, were very complimentary because I read in the annual that they signed at the end of our senior year that they thought I was one of the few in the class who actually presented relevant ideas.
Good for you.
So Vietnam was a big deal. Race relations was a big deal. And one thing I did skip over that I should go back to that really has influenced the whole entire rest of my life took place when I was in 4th grade living in New York. We were in Scarsdale where my aunt, my mother's sister, her husband, and 2 cousins lived. And I was upstairs watching TV in my aunt and uncle's bedroom, and there was a show on about the Holocaust. I had never heard of it. I started watching it until my aunt caught me and told me I wasn't allowed to watch it and pulled me out of there. But I had seen enough. And I had been around larger family, extended family gatherings at my grandparents' apartment and had seen people with numbers on their arms. I didn't know what they were, nor did I ask. But that's when I found out. And I was told then, just don't bring it up. Never talk about it. But when I found out what it was and that it was real, I would have to say that it left a hole in me for the rest of my life. It still continues to do. Man's inhumanity to man, I couldn't believe was something that was real. I thought it was just something you'd see in a horror movie. And I found out reality was worse than any horror movie you could ever see. And that was only reinforced by race relations, by Vietnam. and then just by the political climate in the U.S. in the late 60s.
So, yeah, these are major things that have shaped your life, looking back on them. They're
Yes.
easy to point out, those three areas right there. So you graduated high school, now what, you're gonna go to college?
Yes, I went to Texas Tech my freshman year.
Where'd you go, I'm sorry?
Texas Tech,
Texas
play
Tech.
baseball.
Okay.
And Texas Tech, our baseball was not part of the Southwest Conference that year. We played an independent schedule, probably to save money for travel. So as a freshman, although this wasn't true at other universities, I could play varsity. Back then, freshmen had to play freshman ball. But I was able to play varsity, and as a freshman, I was starting on the varsity team that freshman year. And I had the first coach I ever had that I loved, a guy named Cal Segrist, who came from the New York Yankees organization and was the head coach at Texas Tech. I really enjoyed it, and playing pickup basketball over the holidays, I broke my ankle. It took me almost 2 years to recover from that. And that was the last baseball I played for almost 40 years. When I realized I couldn't return and play, I transferred to the University of Texas. Knowing I couldn't play baseball, there's no use in staying in Lubbock. And back then, the prime bumper sticker that people had on the back of their cars was, "Lucky me, I'm leaving Lubbock." So I had 2 of those. So I transferred to UT. Most of my friends that I've already mentioned, Jumbo Kamen, Mike Grosfeld, Chuck Lewis, were already members of Sigma Alpha Mu, Sammy fraternity. It was a given I was going to join the Sammys when I got there, and I did. For the next 3 years, I was immersed in the Sammy fraternity. That's pretty much all I focused on, because they were diehard sports fanatics. And that's pretty much, I mean, we went to school and I was serious about my classes then finally. But we just had a great time playing sports, intramural sports particularly. Intramural sports, and first with the Sammys through my undergraduate years. During our senior year, the Sammys became the first Jewish fraternity to win the fraternity championship in a major sport. Never happened before. We almost won it in basketball, but came out 1 game short. But in softball, we won the fraternity championship with the University of Texas. First Jewish team to do that. And so that was really neat. We celebrated that for quite a while. I graduated in May of '70. I had a low lottery number. I was going to go in to the service. Got called for my physical for late in May of 1970. So as a precaution, I applied to the Peace Corps and got accepted. When I went for my physical, you still had to go and take it. My ankle injury was such that I was declared 4F and was not eligible to be drafted. I had no idea that was going to be the case, but it was. So I didn't have to go in the Peace Corps, but I was already committed. And I wanted to go back to grad school. So I wound up going to the Peace Corps for 2 weeks. We were stationed in Puerto Rico, in Ponce, Puerto Rico. And I was supposed to be a community organizer, assigned police. That was supposed to be what I was training for. And while we were in Ponce, every afternoon I went over to American University at Ponce and played basketball. And I'm there on their campus, I met some people who ran a breakfast program for the poverty areas on the beach in Ponce. And they wanted to advertise that so kids who weren't getting breakfast could get breakfast. So I volunteered the Peace Corps printing press for that. And we used Peace Corps printing press to print off flyers. And what I didn't know, since it was in Spanish, was at the bottom of the flyers it said sponsored by the People's Independence Party, which was apparently an anti-American group. So when the Peace Corps found out, they politely asked me to leave. So that was a rough 2 weeks, I tell you, Mitch. I was back 2 weeks, all the classic friends had thrown me a big party when I left. Little did I know that 2 weeks later I'd be back, having been kicked out of the Peace Corps. So I went back down to the University of Texas and started on graduate education. Got a master's degree. I finished out a teaching certificate as an undergraduate. I had 2 bachelor's degrees, then I got a master's, and then ultimately stayed in college and got a PhD specializing in learning disabilities. So I wound up being a UT student for 10 straight years, from 66 to 76. And I played intramurals for 10 straight years. And during that time, I wound up making a number of the all-intramural teams that they would announce, kind of like their all-star teams for each division. I got so well known that there's no way they didn't put you on the teams. I set a few records for making the most all-intramural teams while I was there in football and flag football and basketball and handball and softball especially.
That's a great 10 years.
That was a great 10 years.
That's a great 10 years. Well, let's see, so any Jewish organizations at that time that you're going through at UT for those 10 years?
No, just fraternity.
The fraternity.
Yes, we did some holiday stuff with the fraternity, but that was it.
And any events during your 4 years at college that are shaping your life? Obviously the Vietnam War. Other than that, any other events, family, everybody still healthy with you, mom and dad?
I think the main event that might have shaped me was the May 1970 march against the war. It was right after the Kent State shootings. 20,000 students at the University of Texas in Austin showed up and spent the night on the main mall, including Izzy and Mark Short and Steve Gutto. We were all out there. Izzy, during the middle of the night, was walking around the main mall in his bathrobe. And we started a chant saying, "Where's Izzy?" Because we couldn't find him at the time. And about 20 minutes later, throughout the whole West Mall, you heard people yelling, "Where's Izzy?" So somehow Izzy became famous during the Vietnam March. The next morning, we marched from the West Mall through the Capitol Rotunda. Once we got through the Rotunda, people kind of split up and then reformed in the front of the Capitol where there was a wrought iron gate. And right in front of us were several hundred Texas Rangers with shotguns. We came to a stop at that, facing them. And somehow Mark and Izzy and myself were near the front of 20,000 people. It wasn't intentional, it just happened to be there. People from behind us started throwing bottles at the DPS troopers. So they retaliated by shooting tear gas. So we got a taste of tear gas and ran. And that dissembled the entire 20,000 people in the march, but it certainly was a highlight for us. My brother, who's 4 years younger, was watching it in Dallas on TV with my parents. A Dallas station was carrying it. And he distinctly remembers my parents saying, "I sure hope Billy wasn't at that march." The next shot on TV was a close-up of me with my fist in the air yelling, "Free marijuana." I wasn't there to see their expression, but from what Gary told me, it was pretty incredible.
Priceless. So now after college, 10 years, you can't stay at UT. They got no more classes. You're a doctor. What's the profession? What are you doing now?
I went to teach for a couple of years. First I coached, during the last couple of years of my doctoral program, I was a teacher and a basketball coach at Bastrop High School. I was their VAC, which stood for Vocational Adjustment Coordinator. Since I had a special education certification, I placed kids in jobs and supervised them. These were high school kids who were over 16 who could work and go to school at the same time. So I oversaw them, and I also coached the freshman basketball team. And the thing I can remember most was our freshman team, and this is Bastrop, Texas, 1975, about a 70% black school. Our first and second team were all black players. Our third team, we had 15 on the team, had a couple of white kids, but their parents were pretty prominent around the school. I can remember getting a lot of pressure from their parents as to why isn't my son playing? Well, our team went undefeated that year. The last game of the season, we played LaGrange, who had Johnny Johnson on their team, who went on to be an All-American at Texas and an All-Pro defensive back in the NFL. And we won that game. So we had an undefeated season. Still have my team picture from that year. And for the next year, I was not rehired to coach.
That's crazy. That's Texas, right?
So that was Texas then. It was a very racist town. There were 2 students who were black who were killed that year in town, not at the school, but in drive-by shootings. That was Bastrop, Texas in 1975, 76. The kids were great. I didn't see any problem among the kids. Teammates got along. There was no color barrier among the kids. It was the parents.
So at this time, are you married, girlfriend, kids?
I was married. Ben was born in 1974. In 1976, before I left Bastrop, there was a charity game for special education that I set up where the country western station in Austin, KVET, had a traveling basketball team that brought a bunch of UT athletes out to play against faculty at schools to raise money. And I set that game up. It was during maybe February of that year. It was after football season. But the thing that stands out in my mind is Earl Campbell was one of the Texas players who came to play the basketball game. He couldn't even dribble a basketball, but he was there. And I had a picture of him taken with my son, who was 2 at the time. And that was a highlight. That was really cool. After that, I moved to teach at Fort Hays State University in western Kansas. It's the state university, the only one in western Kansas. Teach special education as a professor. Did that for 2 years, and frankly, I missed Austin. And I didn't care if I wasn't going to teach at a university, I just wanted to come back. So I came back to Austin after 2 years, had a daughter, Leah, who was born in '77. Got a job teaching special education for the Austin Independent School District. And worked at the Children's Psychiatric Unit of the Austin State Hospital, but the teachers were all provided by the Austin Public School District, even though it was a state hospital setting. Worked there with my best friend, a guy named Mark Elbaum. Great guy, great basketball player from St. Louis. Was a fraternity brother too. Until 1986. In 1986, I decided to set up a private practice diagnosing children with learning disabilities. And that is something I did and hooked in with the Austin Children's Clinic, which was a private pediatric clinic. So there were 5 pediatricians and myself. And I stayed in that in private practice until I retired, and I got remarried, had gotten divorced, had custody of both my children, and met my wife Brenda in 1987. We got married and moved to Wimberley, Texas. She had just finished her PhD at the University of Texas in special education as well. Just got hired to be a professor at Texas State University, which was then Southwest Texas. So if we moved to Wimberley, it was a lot closer for her. And I've lived there ever since. We've been there for almost 35 years.
That is. Any grandkids?
7 grandchildren.
7?
7 grandchildren.
Can you tell me their names?
Stevie, Brandon, Anthony, Isabella, Ava, Jake, and Reagan.
Fabulous.
Brenda had a son, Colin, when we got married. He was 5. Colin is now a pilot for Southwest Airlines. He grew to 6'7". He was an excellent basketball player at Wimberley High School. Had a chance to come up to Dallas area and play for Collin County Community College or junior college. Chose to. He wanted to fly planes. Made the right decision. he went from Delta Airlines to his dream of Southwest, and he's been with them for 8 or 9 years now. Ben is a football coach. He loves sports just like me. He was an assistant coach for 27 years until he was hired to be a head football coach this year and athletic director.
Is this your son? Or
Yes.
Is your son?
Son Ben, who's be 48. The second player of the second generation of playing the Classic, behind a Meyers son.
There you go. We have Scott Meyers.
Scott Meyers was first, Ben was second.
There you go. Jewish identity while you're married with kids, is it more pronounced now? Is it
No. Now Ben was bar mitzvah. There was a while there, I thought he should experience that, and he did go to Hebrew school, and he got bar mitzvah, did well. But personally, I never went, and I think it was all reflected back to the first time I saw the Holocaust video. And I didn't believe, unfortunately, unlike most of my friends, that if there was such a thing as a God, he would permit something like this. So I didn't believe there was a God.
When did you get the full depth of that? I mean, you're fourth grade, you can't get the whole depth of what's going on.
I think it evolved as I had various experiences regarding racism, being taunted as Jewish when we moved to Texas, Vietnam War. I think all of those kind of coalesced in my mind at some point where I finally realized. I went to a lot of friends' Jewish events, bar mitzvahs and things like that, and weddings, but I just didn't feel a connection religiously. I felt a connection culturally. Yes, somebody asked me if I identify with being Jewish. Yeah, I identify with being Jewish from a cultural perspective, but not from a religious perspective. And I even took Hebrew at college. That was my language at University of Texas. I took 2 years of Hebrew, trying to get myself back into it, but it didn't work.
So I'm going to back up to college because you were there from 66 to 76.
Yes.
So there's a couple of years in there where the University of Texas football team is fabulous, right? And you
Yes.
were watching the 68, 69, 70, 71. So tell us about that. I mean, I know you love sports.
That was great. You're right. Then, for I think the grand total of $25 a year, when you enrolled each semester, you would get a CEC event ticket, which got you into all athletic events and all music events that the university sponsored for the entire year. So, to go to football games, they would draw tickets. You never knew what you were going to get. But yes, we started attending in 67. That was a transition year for Texas. But starting in the middle of 1968, roughly the time they put James Street in as quarterback and started the triple option, they were an incredible football team to watch. And they ran off their 30 straight victories. I saw all the home games. They won 2 national championships. And I was even at the game in 1971 where they played UCLA, where it looked like they were going to end their string of undefeated games, and they came back with a miraculous catch. After Street had graduated, this was Eddie Phillips, quarterback in 71, and kept the string going until Notre Dame beat him in the Cotton Bowl that year. So it was great.
So James Street replaced Bill Bradley.
Super Bill Bradley,
Right.
who became a great cornerback and made a great career in the NFL as all-pro defensive back.
And one more question about sports at UT, because I know you were a huge fan, probably before most people knew about it, was women's basketball at the University of Texas.
It was, it started very quietly. People didn't know what was going on because it was at the old Gregory Gym. Didn't seat but 1,200 people. And they weren't part of the NCAA then. It was AIAW or something. It was a special women's organization that had basketball. And pretty quickly on, they hired a woman named Jody Conrad, who was extremely successful, and she built a fantastic women's program. And it continued for about 20 years. There was a time they won over 100 consecutive conference games, I think. You'd have to look it up, but it's something like that.
And they won a national
And
championship.
they won a national championship with Clarissa Davis as their star.
Undefeated, I believe.
Yeah, and Andrew Lloyd, those were their undefeated, you're right.
Yeah, unbelievable, because I remember talking to you about it.
Yeah, and I think it was Southern Cal they played. Reggie Miller's sister, Cheryl Miller, was their big star, and Texas beat them.
So, what do you do for fun? Tell us a little bit about that now, or, you know.
Let me go back to one thing
Sure, yeah.
that I just remembered. Basketball, men's basketball was in the old Grigory gym then too. First come, first served team. And I had seen a Sports Illustrated article about new sophomore, remember freshmen couldn't play. LSU has a new star coming named Pete Maravich. So myself and Mark Elbaum, we had read the article, we'd heard of him. We went to see that game, sat on right behind the LSU bench, front row. We were the first ones there. We wanted to watch him warm up. Had the floppy socks. I guess he's 19 years old. It was only a second or third varsity game. And we were talking to him from the side and asking him to throw the ball behind his back and just joking with him. It was really neat. So I can say that up close and personal, we got to see Pete Maravich at the very beginning of his college career. And obviously he set a total points record that'll never be beaten.
Even with 3-point shots now,
Even
it'll
with
never be.
no 3-point shot,
Yeah.
he only was allowed to play 3 years because there was no freshman ball then. But anybody that good now is going to leave for the pros.
Yeah.
And he averaged 42, 43, and 44 points a year for his sophomore, junior, and senior year.
Right. They would put 2 or 3 guys on him.
Yeah. And we saw him throw a full court fast break pass between his legs.
That's great. That's a great story. So back to what do you do for fun now? What do you
Now,
enjoy doing?
beginning in, I played very competitive softball from early 1970s all the way up through 1993. I was on an all-black softball team in Austin called the Austin Warriors. I was the youngest one on the team. Everybody else was probably 10 or 15 years older than me. And we had a great team. We played in Gibbons Park in East Austin. There were about 8 teams in the league. Myself and 2 other people, the only white people in the league. But I was the only one on the Warriors, and they were the best team. And I was there strictly for defense. I could get a hit every single time, it wouldn't matter. I'd still bat last. But I was their best defensive outfielder, so they stuck me where all the fly balls went. And I stuck with that team for a number of years. It was a wonderful experience. We were sponsored by several different bars and nightclubs, and so after the games, we got to go there and just hang out. They'd raise money for trips by volunteering to be busboys at some of those, to get tips to use to pay for our expenses to go to out-of-town trips. One in particular that stands out was outside of Wharton, Texas. We went to play a Victoria, Texas tournament. And we didn't get finished till about 1 in the morning for the first day of the tournament. We didn't have any place to stay, so we went to get a hotel room. And they wouldn't give hotel rooms to any of the black players. So they set me up to get a room. They told the black players that the rooms were filled. They sent me up to get a room. I didn't wear my uniform, I just went up. I got a room immediately. So we all piled in there and spent the night. That's another thing that reinforces this stuff. So that was 1972 or 3, I think. I played in that league for a long time. When that team finally dissolved, I went to a Hispanic team. And that was a real fun. It was a very family atmosphere, things I really didn't have as a kid. I really enjoyed the whole family atmosphere of both teams. Everybody was welcome there. The kids could sit on the bench if they want. There was no separation of players and fans and family. They'd have announcers from black radio stations to come out and announce the games, and really made it a special event.
That's fun. That's all great stuff. Anything now that you like to travel, besides sports, or you go with your wife?
Yeah, we like to go to national parks.
National parks.
So that's what we've been doing most of the time when we're not. We've gone to Europe 5 times, and primarily to Paris area and Amsterdam. That's where we've hung out. And Trento, Italy. Those are the areas that we really love. But that's what we like to do. One thing I omitted was that our softball team got to the point that we played for the U.S. championship for the USSSA, which is United States Slow Pitch Softball Association. This is the highest level you can play in this country for our age group. That was the 35 and over tournament. We went to 5 of those, and generally there were 1 to 200 teams that were entered, and we never won it, but we got as high as 5th, and we never finished out of the top 10.
Fabulous.
But we won numerous Texas State Championships in that.
That's great.
So I'm going to ask you 3 questions that are a bit, they're not specific, so think about them and give the best answers you can. What accomplishments are you most proud of, Billy?
Well, I don't know that I'm overly proud of anything I've done. I guess being fortunate enough to be married to Brenda, and of course your children, grandchildren. Those are givens, I think, but I should state them. Having good friends like you, Mitch, and Ronnie, and Seth, and Mark, Guth. I would have to think that avoiding the traps of putting people down throughout and standing up for injustice, I'm pretty proud of that.
Those are big accomplishments.
Yeah, I mean, it was in small ways, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
there are little things I've done in my life that I haven't mentioned that all contributed to saying that. And I guess I started playing baseball again. I mentioned, getting hurt at Texas Tech in 1966. I picked up baseball again in 1993. It's a long time in between. And started playing men's senior baseball, starting with a 35 and over league, all the way up to 75 and over now. So during that time, we put teams together that have won the World Championship, World Series in Arizona 16 times now.
Fabulous.
So that's a pretty big accomplishment when you consider it, including a lot of professional former major league players along the way.
I think it is, absolutely.
So can you tell us a little bit about what your view of how the world is different today, obviously the big differences, and the early years growing up in New York and in early years at Dallas? Just some things for perspective.
That's a pretty profound question. I don't think people are different. I think, the peripheral things in the world have changed, obviously, through technology. Climate change, social awareness. I think the combination of all of those brings the contrast of the have and have-nots in the world into so much greater focus. I hate to admit it, but I've got a very pessimistic view of things, and most of my friends know this, that I talk too seriously about things, but to me, the human species, particularly the male Homo sapien of the human species, is kind of a failed species. In my view, the harm that this species does to each other, the injustice that is put upon each other, and the planet now, is a very sad thing to observe. I think the human species, Homo sapiens specifically, will be the shortest lived species in the history of this planet. I think our lifespan will be much shorter than mammals, insects, fish, because I think we'll run ourselves into a mass extinction at some point. And I think that's primarily due to the human male. And I wish it could be more optimistic, because there are a lot of good people in the world. But for some reason, those who seem to call the shots, there's a line, the masters make the rules for the wise men and the fools. It's a Bob Dylan line. And I think it's pretty true. No matter where you look, whether it's the African subcontinent, South American subcontinent, Central Europe, Asian continent, what's foreboding in this country, it's, to me, very pessimistic. I wish I saw more bright signs, but I know a lot of people do think I'm way off on this, and I hope I am. But sad to say, Mitch, that's my outlook.
That's your outlook. So, thank you for answering that. I know it is, these are tough questions, but, can you say one thing that that you want your family and friends to remember about you?
Wow. I think the one thing they would all agree on is that I've always tried to make people laugh. Can't tell that in this interview, but that's generally the case. I think all my grandkids would tell you that, and most of my friends would tell you that, and the people I play ball with. I think, given my outlook in life, I thought, and always have thought, that the best way to deal with it is try to find humor in the moment and try to enjoy the moment by bringing laughter, because that does seem to be a universal.
Thank you for that. So, last thing, unless you have anything to add after this question, is what advice would you like to leave for the next generation that watches your oral history, including your grandkids, that will see this down the road?
Beware of leaders. They'll take you where you don't want to go. That's my advice, is anytime people are trying to take away rights, I think you have to look very close at those kind of people. Equality should be the overall human rule. Nobody's better, nobody's worse than anybody else. We're all just people. And if we can solve the need to dominate, then I think maybe we'll be on a much better course.
That's great advice. And I hope a lot of people watch this interview because it was fantastic. Is there anything else, Billy?
God, no.
Well, I want to say thank you from the Dallas Jewish Historical Society and from myself. Thank you.
It's an honor, Mitch.